Excellent. Good afternoon to everybody in the room and to the over 50 people we have online from all across the country. Can I start by paying my respect to the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri people that we are on in Melbourne, and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, not only on this country, but where everyone is online as well. My name's Iain MacKenzie and I'm Chair of the Board for Natural Hazards Research Australia, a position I've been very proud to accept and have since December last year. And it's an absolute honour to be able to close this afternoon. Andrew's had to race off and deal with something that is important to all of us, which are family matters and children, which is a terrific thing to do and look after family. This afternoon we are going to have a keynote speaker first, and followed by a panel session. And given the excellent timing that we've all been managed to achieve, that you've been able to achieve in the past 3 days, my commitment is to try and get you out of here on time at 3:30. We'll invite questions certainly after the keynote, and we will also have Slido questions and questions from the floor for a panel session this afternoon. And this afternoon's session is an open session. It's being hosted both by NHRA and University of Melbourne, and it is of course our final session. Our keynote this afternoon is Professor Daniel Aldrich. Professor Aldrich is a Professor of Political Science and Director of the Security and Resilience Studies Program at Northeastern University in the United States. Welcome, Daniel. He is a leading expert in disaster resilience and how social infrastructure can be supported to save lives and improve resilience. An award-winning researcher and author, he's published 5 books, more than 90 peer-reviewed articles, and written op-eds for the New York Times, CNN, Huffington Post, and many other media outlets. He spent more than 5 years in India, Japan, and Africa, completing fieldwork, and his work has been funded by the Fulbright Foundation, the National Sciences Foundation, the ABE Foundation, the Rasmussen Foundation, and the Japan Foundation, amongst others. Professor Aldrich today will talk about social infrastructure's critical role in mitigating shocks. Would you all please help me in welcoming Professor Aldrich?
Iain, thank you very much. Thank you as well to David and Lisa and everyone else who's done the work to get me here today. Just in case there isn't time today, either in person or online, I put out my email address and my Twitter handle. My family would say I'm on those things far too much, so let's prove them correct. Feel free to reach out to me with questions, discussions, criticisms, or offers of grants. They're up there. I want to begin with a story that I find quite interesting, and this is a true story, so work with me here for a few minutes. Imagine you live in a society hit not by one shock or 2 shocks, but the same shock almost every 100 years. So since the beginning of recorded history in Japan, in the Tohoku area in the Northeast, there have been massive tsunami waves that have hit ashore with regularity since around 1200 and probably even before then as well. Now, you live in a community along the coast and you have a lot of options. How do you get ready for that next tsunami that you know is going to come? And these tsunami aren't small waves like you find here in Melbourne or up in Sydney, Bondi Beach, right? These are massive 20-meter kind of waves that destroy the entire village pretty much every time they come. So I've taken 2 communities in Tohoku. They're neighbors side by side, Taro to the north and Sumohama to the south. Contiguous communities, same demographics, same kind of people. But in the 1930s, these 2 communities took very different trajectories of what we would call disaster risk reduction. One of them began building massive seawalls, huge. In fact, they were so expensive, this community went bankrupt several times in the 1960s, paying for what we can call known as the Great Wall of Japan, about a 14-meter high seawall, about 20 meters at its base. I've got images up here behind me of that approach. So that community built this massive seawall. In contrast, their neighbor decided, rather than building what we call gray or physical infrastructure, they would instead build trust, cooperation, and training. And you see one of the images here. When they train for this kind of natural hazard, the younger people in the community put the elderly people in wheelbarrows and they pull them uphill, right? Because both communities are flat on the coast. And of course, safer ground is about 1 kilometer inland. I want to stop and just have you have a thought question. Which community did better on March the 11th, 2011, when a 9.0 magnitude earthquake set off 20-meter tsunami that hit both communities at the exact same time? That's a thought question. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. Okay. Since I myself in 2005 was in Hurricane Katrina, and you've probably heard the story before, so forgive me, but we lost our home, our stuff, our car to that massive human-made disaster, I've been obsessing with the concept that the driver for resilience has so little to do with outside agencies, aid, wealth, education, and so much to do with internal resources, communal resources, things like social capital. I'm sure you all know already that we divide social capital into bonding, bridging, and linking ties. Bonding ties connect people who are quite similar. If you want to be fancy, we call those homophilous ties. People that sound like you, look like you, think like you, have the same kind of food preferences. Fortunately for humanity, we also have bridging ties that connect us to people who are different than us. Bridging ties often come through conferences, institutions, workplaces, churches, synagogues, and mosques, places where we meet people that are different. Where bonding and bridging are horizontal ties, linking ties are vertical ties, connecting me and someone above me with authority and power, like Lisa Gibbs, for example. Now, these kind of ties play very different roles in different types at the moment of the disaster. And just to give you a few reasons why these matter so much, the very first decision made by any survivor of a shock, including us back in 2005 after Hurricane Katrina, was whether or not to stay in a damaged area and rebuild, or to go someplace else. We call this exit and voice after Albert Hirschman's work in the 1960s. What we found around the world is communities that are tied together by trust and reciprocity. Those communities use voice more often. They stay in their community and work together. More atomized, more disparate communities, in contrast, often break apart and individuals leave in higher numbers. We also see that collective action comes from these kind of ties. The ability to work collectively at a moment of stress, and that information and resources come together, what we call mutual aid. With that kind of background, I want to argue now that one of the underlooked ways that we can build our communities up to the next shock is through social infrastructure. Social infrastructure I'll get to in a second, but the background to social infrastructure comes from several different intellectual foundations. Does anyone recognize, by the way, the lady with the glasses up there? Yes, very well. Who said that? Yes, Jane Jacobs, excellent. Jane Jacobs was the dean, or deanette, I guess nowadays, deanette of the idea that cities are not about efficiency, getting from place A to place B, but rather about building chances for interaction and for building that trust. Next to Jane Jacobs is the work of Oscar Newman. And Newman argued for defensible space, places and spaces in society where we feel connected. He found in communities where you had housing that you took a role in, crime rates were lower because you pushed away individuals who had come in to cause mischief and invited more friends and friends over to play bocce ball in your backyard. Oldenburg's argument about third spaces between workplaces and home, coffee shops, certainly here in Melbourne would be a good example, but other kinds of places as well, karaoke, for example, places to get together, bowling alleys, and finally more broadly public space. So social infrastructure builds on these and argues that we need places in society where we build trust and connections to each other. In my new work I'm working on right now, there are 4 different types of social infrastructure. The first I would call parks, and you are blessed here in Australia to have many of them. I'm actually in Adelaide, so our whole city is a park. So we have public places, parks, outdoor spots, but we also have community centers, right? Places where we get together. We have mosques, synagogues, churches, gurdwaras, places to get together, temples as well, and finally restaurants and other social businesses. Those 4 types of social infrastructure, I'm going to argue in a second, are critical to building resilience in societies to any kind of shock, including, by the way, COVID-19 and other shocks. And here's why. We're using mobility data and other kinds of personal information to track what happens in these kind of social infrastructure spaces. What happens, for example, when you go to a park with your kids, or walk into a restaurant, or go to a new church or synagogue or mosque or gurdwara? What happens in those spaces? Here's what we're finding. The kind of ties that are being built are bridging ties, connections between people who had not known each other very well before. So for example, if I go to a park in Adelaide and see someone who's a new resident of Adelaide, perhaps from Afghanistan, whose English is not their first language, we can still throw the ball back and forth, play with our dogs, have our kids play together. Those are the kind of moments that Jane Jacobs said, they build our cities and they build our society. And what we found across time, and this data now comes from 27 different cities, is that in communities with more of these kind of spots, social infrastructure, those bridging ties are stronger. In contrast, bonding and linking ties have almost no impact from these kind of spots. Let's see if this actually works. I'll give you another story now. After those disasters I mentioned already in Japan, the 3/11 disasters, the community of Masakicho decided that they would build a communal space called Ibasho. Ibasho in Japanese means my place. And you notice from our board of directors here, you have to be a spring chicken to be on it. You have to be 65 years or older. And they get together every week for the last 4.5 years, actually even before then, and decide what are we doing this week in Ibasho? Will it be a library for the small children? Will it be a yogurt making event? Will it be yoga for the adults? We would deliver food to people nearby. Ibasho is a deliberate space, a communal gathering spot where we kind of build these ties. And we tracked from the very beginning of this local community structure, what impact did it have on people who attend and those who don't attend. We've actually tracked 3 different outcomes. On the screen I have now network breadth. What number of friends do you speak with? And by the way, these are elderly individuals, the kind of people that we typically assume don't build new ties easily. Individuals attending Ibasho more regularly have broader networks. Additionally, individuals attending Ibasho more regularly have more sense of efficacy, their ability to make the world a better place, and also a sense of belonging. So we can see that these kind of structures don't have to be 100 years old or 200 years old to have impact. Even a relatively new community space, a new gurdwara, a new park, those have the same possibility of building these kind of ties. Now, what happens when we have communities with or without these kind of social infrastructure spots? Now I'll go back to that data from 3/11 in Japan. We looked at 700 communities along the coast. We found in communities with greater density of these kind of projects, parks, community spaces, religious organizations, and private social businesses, those communities had lower mortality rates, controlling for 15 other factors, including, of course, the obvious, demographics, the power of the wave, accessibility, income, and so forth. So this is some of the first research that we know of, at least, that's trying to connect the density and the quality of social infrastructure to the outcome during disasters. And the results are fantastic. To point out some things on this slide here, all you need here are 2 of those kind of facilities for every 100 residents, right? That's 0.02. That's the density here normed by population. That means you have a community that may only have a few hundred people in it with a few of these facilities. Their mortality rates are roughly 3.5 to 4 times lower on average than a similar community that in contrast has very few or none of those kind of spots. So even a low number of them can have a measurable impact over time. So the first thing we see is, 1, we can build these kind of social infrastructure facilities, and the second is they have a major impact during the shock itself. What happens after shocks? What happens after a major disaster? To what degree do these kind of social infrastructure facilities have an impact on recovering of population and recovering of local economies? So we're tracking now in North America across 16 different parishes, which are basically like counties in Louisiana, the impact of the major hurricanes that have been there, and then rebuilding afterwards. So here you see along the coast, and by the way, if you care, my old home in New Orleans was where that B is in St. Bernard. That's where my home was, there in the New Orleans Peninsula. And we have across these areas a variety of ways of measuring both recovery of individuals and recovery of economy. We took those measurements of outcomes and then began looking what kind of projects, what kind of investments had come from local, regional, and national authorities. After a major shock, there are all kinds of things that you could do. Most common in industrialized democracies, unfortunately, is investing in gray infrastructure facilities, right? So bridges are damaged, roads are damaged, schools are damaged. The first thing that we build with a lot of money are those kind of gray infrastructure facilities. So here behind me, we measured those what are called hard. That's the crossed, I guess it's a screwdriver and a wrench we use there. We also measured, in contrast, soft investments in places like libraries, in parks, in social infrastructure. We measured local investments, that is, ideas that came up from the bottom, the community itself. And we also measured state level, that is to say, regional and national level government investments. And then we tracked what happens in terms of population recovery and what happens in terms of economic recovery. Is there a laser on this? Oh, there is a laser. Very cool. Okay. I don't know if you can even see this dot out here, but I'm assuming you can. Let's just track from the beginning. Let's start by looking at how much money begins flowing back into communities after a major disaster. So if the only investments that you put your money into are these large-scale gray infrastructure facilities, roads, ports, dams, bridges, gray infrastructure, in fact, the overall levels of recovery here, which is statistically significant, are less. Less money is flowing back in. You could probably guess why, right? If you're, as I was, coming back to a community hit by a major shock, and all the money is pouring into massive gray infrastructure projects, that helps the construction people, which is great. It helps people driving the cars. But if you only care about getting your kids to school and buying groceries, it's not a very helpful investment for locals. So there's actually less money is being generated by that. So too, if the major investments that are coming into your community are regional or nationally based, if the ideas for those projects come from above you, top-down planning, then again, we see negative income. People are actually having less money than before. In contrast now, imagine that you're investing in bottom-up social infrastructure. Then what you're seeing now is significant levels, much more money is coming in with both those kind of investments. Meaning something is happening in the communities where they're building back local facilities that people actually use. Parks, churches, pubs. We're getting more people to spend money locally. And here's the other good news. Let's look now at the number of people who return to communities along the coast hit by a major hurricane. Again, if the only investment you had was large-scale gray, fewer individuals return. One of my colleagues in Japan, Nagamatsu Shingo, calls this the reconstruction paradox. The communities that had the most damage, where the government is pouring in the most top-down facilities, those are the ones people come back to with less frequency. So too, again, if all the plans you have in place are coming from above you, they're top-down planning from the state, we're seeing negative in terms of in-migration, people coming back. But if you're investing in communities, resources, infrastructure, you see more people coming back. So it's pretty amazing. Again, we think this is first research of this kind, both in terms of income and in terms of population. Social infrastructure after the disaster is drawing back what we'd call good recovery. I can give all kinds of other examples now how we're doing this across other areas. This is actually a counterfactual synthetic model that we built, showing what happens in communities if you build things like, let's say, community centers, as opposed to other kind of facilities. And again, what we're seeing here is per capita income is growing most when we have high connectivity and those kind of community centers, and also population recovery as well, going up much higher and keeping down outmigration as well. Okay, I've tried to argue so far that social infrastructure is an often overlooked aspect, both of getting ready for the disaster, but also in recovering for it afterwards. What challenges are there if, in fact, this is a new way to look for us as disaster scholars? The first is that there is very little good data on social infrastructure presence or quality. I put up a map here we've done on social capital of the entire contiguous America. In fact, to our knowledge, there has not yet been a larger scale study of social infrastructure facilities across either all of Australia or all of North America. By the way, there are really good studies of some small areas in Australia, very, very good ones, probably done by people in this room right now. But at a national scale, at a regional scale, we don't have that research. So one area to think about is, what can we do as scholars and residents in our communities to map out the density and quality of these kind of social infrastructure facilities? Next is, in cities we have mapped out, infrastructure distribution is very unequal. This is just in my hometown now of Boston, Massachusetts. And by the way, my community is called Brighton. It's right here in the bottom third, if you look. Again, I mentioned 4 types of community spaces, places of worship, businesses, and parks. You can see the very, very top communities here have very high levels of them per capita, while the bottom levels, in some cases, literally have 0. There are no community spaces. There are no places of worship out in the Harbor Islands, and there are no social businesses. So you can see a tremendous contrast right here across parts. And this is just Boston, as I mentioned. So where we have done mapping of these kinds of facilities, it is not evenly distributed across our societies, which is a real problem. Next, if you think about investments in physical infrastructure, gray infrastructure, bridges, ports, dams, which again is the most common kind of investment that we see from central and local governments. And you compare that to what we're calling soft money. And I got this slide from a friend of mine, so I apologize, I didn't build it myself. But basically what he pointed out to me was the following. Out of 25 trillion yen being spent in Japan on disaster recovery, 96% of that money is going into things like concrete walls, embankments, large-scale gray physical infrastructure. And less than 6% is going into what we're calling soft infrastructure, which includes things, for example, like bottom-up planning, engagement, and so forth. So the money that's being spent across our society is overwhelmingly biased to a large-scale physical infrastructure. Okay, to wrap up, good for me. So first, I tried to argue today that oftentimes when we think about disasters and shocks, one of the most common misconceptions that we have is that we're going to be saved by a seawall, saved by a firewall, saved by access roads. Our vision for, even in things mitigating the shock, is often centered around, I forgot to ask you the question. Okay, show of hands. There's 2 communities in Japan. One built the seawalls, and one did wheelbarrow evacuations. I want to see a show of hands. Who thinks those who built the seawalls had a lower mortality rate? Raise your hands. Really? Seriously? Okay, and those who did evacuations by wheelbarrow? You're right. 4 times lower mortality rate in the community that built only wheelbarrow routes. And I can talk more about that if you're interested, by the way, why that would be. I'll give you 3 quick reasons why. I did interviews with both communities. In Taro, with the massive seawalls, no one could see the hazard. So they read about the hazard coming on their phones. They heard the sirens going off, but no one in the community could see the tsunami coming. So if you can't see the tsunami coming, why evacuate? Second of all, if the local businesses spent $40 billion US building a seawall, why bother evacuating? You better be safe, right? It's a lot of money you put in there, right? And then, of course, the third reason you wouldn't leave this kind of community is because you haven't drilled this at all. The other community that's been using wheelbarrows drills every year, twice a year, and your community doesn't need to. So yes, you're exactly right. The community that built social infrastructure did better. Next, we often don't appreciate that the parks, places of worship, and pubs in our communities, those are sites where we're building disaster resilience. It might feel like the annoying place, right, where dogs are pooping or kids are yelling or whatever else, the annoyances that come with them, rowdy chaps drinking too much alcohol. But those are the spots in our society exactly where we're building those kind of bridging ties. Again, not people that you know really well, your friends, your mates from school, your family members, right? But people that you don't know as well that you might need to rely on in a shock, that you might need information from, right, during some kind of disaster. So those spots in our society that we have, some of them, have us a lot of them, right, are underappreciated. Next, I tried to argue that those communities with better access to these kind of spaces have lower mortality rates, better population recovery rates, and better economic recovery rates as well. And finally, I'm going to argue that we underinvest in these kind of facilities, right? They're the first to be cut. Here in North America, where I'm from at least, the first thing to be cut during political fights are the budgets of libraries. Very first thing that goes. In fact, I think it was in Louisiana 2 weeks ago. The budget now is 0 for some libraries for this upcoming fiscal year, right? So the first thing to get cut is social infrastructure. And I would say that it's important. Thank you.
Daniel, thank you very much. And that's some fascinating aspects there that I can't help. My mind was going back a couple of years to a series of, smallish fires across the country that we were dealing with in different departments. Hannah's looking at me going, yep. And the value of that social infrastructure. And there was one instance where a number of local councils overnight had $1 million deposited into their accounts and said, go use it. But, you know, it was use it on what, and without that support, how were they to make those decisions? Because that model of treatment effects that you had up there just wasn't there for them to think about. So they absolutely defaulted to the hard infrastructure, and yet there were so many arguments that were had across the nation at all levels of political level. I certainly remember a situation where we had a federal member, a state member, a local member, all talking about money and how to spend it, and they all knew what was best for their community, and everything was different. And how do you do that? And I think that brings us back to what we've been talking about, is how do we build that evidence to support that decision making? Of course, that was all hypothetical. That never really happened at all. Can I invite questions from the floor for the Professor, please? We've got a couple of roving mics. In terms of your own research, how does that link? There's one up the back.
Sorry. Oh, okay. Thank you for that. That was really interesting. So I'm wondering more, I guess, in the developing country context, although not to say that we don't have corruption in the developed world as well, we definitely do. But how does social infrastructure work when you have corruption and like poor leadership and whatnot that can undermine those processes?
Great, so that's a fantastic question. Most of my own research is in developed nations, so Japan, North America, Australia, but there's actually really good work that's being done both in Mexico and also in India on the role of these kind of facilities. What we're finding is typically the major corruption happens above that micro local level. So for example, if NGOs, if libraries get money, that money goes into the library. But if politicians, regional organizations, national level ones get money, where it actually ends up, we don't know. And there's a really great book now, actually, I was reading a few other days ago, on Mexican response to crime and the use of art and cultural facilities actually as social infrastructure. It's sort of a haven for local residents and youth who want to get away from what would be physically harmful areas, but also want to invest in their own skills in the future. So it's a great question. I don't have hard data on that, but I would say even in societies, I think like Mexico, where we do see corruption and broader questions of poor governance, I think there has been qualitative research showing that these kind of facilities have an impact as well.
Thanks for the talk, Daniel. That was really interesting. Just wondering what evidence there is, if you know, over here, sorry.
Sorry, the lights are in my eyes.
We increasingly live our lives online, and probably everyone has opinions about what that means here, but just curious if you know of any evidence connected to, you know, social connections and disasters in our online existences.
Yeah, this is a fantastic question. So one of my students, who's now a faculty member at IUPUI, Courtney Page-Tan, her thesis was on what I would call the old man doubt, which is that, well, if people are online, do they actually get stuff done in real life? And she showed pretty persuasively, to me at least, that individuals who are active online, some people might call them slacktivists or clicktivists, but people who organize petitions, who do things that come to our events, are also active in real life. And her thesis went through a number of examples in North America about people who were active both in the IRL communities, but also active in online ones. So she would argue, I think, if she were here, that online communities have the same potential to be strong social infrastructure facilities, places where you can have those connections, people who, for example, can't leave their houses regularly, can make connections to people. I know as well during Hurricane Harvey in Texas, online WhatsApp forums were exactly where people organize rescue efforts with the Cajun Navy, as they call it, which are local residents using their own pirogues and canoes to go out and rescue people, well before FEMA or the Coast Guard or other people. So I think I'm optimistic. I know some of my colleagues are more skeptical about sort of the online communities, and we've seen the damage that social media can do, especially to younger children, adolescents especially. But I think for developing communities that are looking to find a place online, I think you have to have some aspect of your work. I know all of us have web pages and all of us are on Twitter. I know I am. I think because so much of our society now is online, and I think certainly for my own children, I see them doing both, right? So they're in a Roblox event, but they're actually raising money online for a real life thing, right? Or they're doing a charity event for a local school, but actually going to that school. So I think I'm optimistic that there is a positive crossover from the online world that can find social infrastructure there as well.
Thank you, Daniel. That was a really interesting presentation. I've loved your research over the years as well. I'm Deanne Bird. I'm with Monash University, but also with the Department of Health here in Victoria. Just reflecting on our experience here in Victoria and Melbourne in particular during COVID, there was an article published in the news about our access to green spaces during our lockdowns. Just wondering if there's any research that you're aware of or you've been undertaking yourself, looking at the mental health impacts and how that relates to those green spaces and access to them.
Yes, 1,000%. So there's now 2 really good articles that our team has done, one, another team on the outside, that shows 2 things. Actually, this was in Philadelphia. So they took 64,000 lots across the area in the city, out of which 5,000 were randomly greened, right? So they had been areas that were abandoned, filled with mattresses or debris or rats, or whatever else. And then they began measuring the impact on people within about half a kilometer of those newly greened areas. So several things happened that are interesting. One is crime went down as people began to seeing these as viable spaces for social infrastructure. So kids began playing there, adults put up lights in these areas, people used them. And then actually mental health also improved as well, right? What had been an eyesore, a sense of maybe discomfort or abandonment from the city, began a feeling of connection now. Oh, the government really does care about my community. There's another paper I just saw actually on green space and crime. This looked over, I think, Canadian cities over about a 3-decade period. It's pretty cool. They claimed for every 200 trees that were planted, one crime was averted and 4 suicides were stopped. They had some really amazing, strong links. So, but yes, I think there's a lot of really good research showing that these kind of park-based social infrastructure have a positive impact for all kinds of reasons. And if you read them, they're really interesting. Some of them claim that being in nature actually, in a sense, is a form of psychic mitigation. It reduces our levels of threat, whatever we're feeling now kind of gets depressed. The other argument in contrast is that it's where we can meet, because typically outdoor spaces with trees have shade. Right, so rather than meeting in some concrete lot or a parking lot, who wants to hang out in a parking lot, right? These are spaces for connection, so that it provides us a space naturally. Well, yeah, I'll meet you outside in that park nearby, rather than in the parking lot. So yes, I think there's really good research on the impact of greening spaces.
We'll swap mics. While we're swapping mics there, Daniel, I might just ask.
It's working now, sorry. I was just wondering if in any of the case studies that you've been looking at globally, has there been examples of positive, I suppose, connection between where there has been hard infrastructure or grey infrastructure decisions with ground up decision making? So for example, if we're talking about roads being replaced, communities getting to choose to prioritise which roads, you know, if we're talking about what's important is getting your kids to school and going to the shops, you know, being able to prioritise the roads that get most people there rather than it being at a top-down approach?
That's a fantastic question. So the challenge for me is, in Japan, it's been all or nothing. Those communities investing in bottom-up plans have pushed aside plans for seawalls. There's actually a brand new article that came out 2 days ago from a colleague of mine in Japan. He showed that the communities, like the one I mentioned earlier, that didn't build seawalls, all of their recovery metrics are higher than those that did build seawalls. And he would argue it's because communities were involved in the decision not to build, but they were not involved in the decision to build. So there was a top-down process in one and a bottom-up in the other. I think it's a good point. I mean, I don't have the straight research, but I think if a community could decide, we really want this road, we really want this bridge, I think the challenge for me is when I've been observing at the local level, we call community budgeting processes. I don't know if they have these in Melbourne or Sydney, where the community decides how to spend the money. It's almost never on, let's say, a large scale grey infrastructure. It's almost small scale stuff. So after school programs, training for teachers, things for kids to go to, museums. So the money that I've seen chosen in those moments has typically begun not this large scale projects, which are usually government funded from the top, right? So in North America, at least, the most of the budget for these huge grey projects comes via large things like the DOT, Transportation Department, for example, as opposed to bottom up. So it's a good question. I just haven't seen examples of really good hybrid decision making where a community has chosen to build a massive interstate highway, right? And that's been better. I think if you could find one, that'd be a great thesis for someone to do. I mean, that'd be a great moment, right? To find that where the government says we're building 1,000 kilometers of roads, you tell us where to put them. But again, I can't think of one, but I think that'd be a great moment for research.
Yeah. Jack, I'm from Jesuit Social Services Centre for Just Places. Thank you for that talk. There's a lot of data in there that will help us advocate for the role of the community sector in building climate resilience. My question is, you spoke mainly around bridging ties, and similar to the last question, around linking ties and the role of the community sector and community services in enabling that. So in terms of getting the voices of those who are most at risk to inform decision making, as an avenue to hand over power to that more grassroots level through those trusted relationships that are held within those community spaces. Yeah, whether there's any research of yours and data to looking at the implications of the linking ties, essentially, of these community spaces in resilience outcomes. Yeah, the role of the...
Yeah, absolutely. So it's funny, in a previous project I did, and I can plug it now, it's my book called Black Wave, which came out about 3.5 years ago. I did try to argue, in Japan at least, that links between local communities and vertical ties to decision makers improve the recovery processes. So I think there is pretty good quantitative data on that point, that where you have the ear of decision makers and a strongly cohesive community, the outcome is better overall. This project, though, has not yielded those kind of results. That is to say, social infrastructure does not seem to be the spot, at least, where I connect to my decision maker. It seems much more about, again, what Jane Jacobs called the chance encounter, right? Building trust with someone that you hadn't met before. So I think I would still commit to the argument that linking ties are critical, and they absolutely impact the disaster recovery process. But I'm not sure these are the facilities where they get built. I guess that'd be my answer.
Right.
Daniel, as we run the microphone to the next one, I might just ask you if you can address the top question on the Slido is about how do we make those soft investments more politically appealing? Because we all know there's money for the hard stuff and shovels in ground to make good pictures.
Right. Yeah, this is a really tough question, and I think it'll require things that aren't necessarily there yet, at least where I'm doing my research. You know, one is politicians with political will to say, even though the seawall is more visible than investing in a library or investing in local groups, I'm willing to put my career aside for a second and invest in the better data-supported process. I haven't met many politicians, at least in North America, who have that kind of political will. I think the other challenge we need to do as researchers and scholars is speak to them more often. And this is I do this all the time, whenever I get a moment. And in fact, I'm doing this in Australia, so maybe it'll have an impact, I don't know. But I try to bother people with power and say, what do you know about recovery? Like, what's your impression? Like, what do you think builds communities back better? Do you believe that it's bridges, roads, and grey infrastructure? Or do these kind of last to be funded, first to be cut kind of projects have an impact? I think that kind of question has an interesting moment then when I hear from the politician, well, yeah, of course, you know, why wouldn't I need a new road to get my things in faster? So I think part of that is also on us to advocate more for these kind of facilities, because again, they're not what you think about automatically when you think about disaster resilience, right? You think about seawalls or whatever else.
And I think the second one that almost leads in a little bit, it's, you know, do the benefits of social infrastructure build the trust, or do we need the trust to start with?
Yeah, this is a really important question. So I would strongly argue that deliberately created, or some would say artificially created social ties like Ibasho came from a community where no one had met each other at all before. All those elders I showed before on that slide, they'd been moved there randomly, which is great for a social scientist, great, really bad for them as human beings, but for a social scientist trying to measure this. So that was a community completely from scratch. No one had met before, they'd never worked together before, and over the course of 2 years, they went from not being co-organized to having a new community center that had all these impacts. So I would strongly argue that, in fact, yes, from scratch, it is possible to deliberately build these kind of facilities.
Excellent. Do we have one more from the floor? There's ready.
Thanks, Daniel. My question related to our traditional measures of economic activity like GDP. Does that measure mask the distributional aspects of that recovery economy?
Interesting. So I would say, to begin with, you know, GDP or per capita income itself isn't a great way to measure much in our society, besides are we building more things? And I think for most of us in the room, we probably recognize the power of social ties, even if we can't monetize them or necessarily quantify how much they're worth. I have seen some pretty cool work from England, actually, on quantifying the role of social infrastructure. That is to say, how much is a library actually worth to us? And I'll give you an example. Right, so you build the library and you might think, well, the value is the land, the building, and the books inside it. Or maybe if you're really clever, you think, well, every book that's there is 10 books I didn't have to purchase, right? So I'm saving money for the community. But what we've found in our research qualitatively is that library also serves as a cooling center during a hot summer in Boston and a warming center during a cold winter in Boston. It also is where ESL classes are taught for people who are first coming to the library. It's also where students come who have bad home lives, who want a calm place to work and get their homework done. So if you begin to actually try to put all that stuff in, none of that makes it into a GDP measure, right? The library is just, typically in economic speak, an empty building, right? It's not really relevant. But if you think about what I call the social benefit analysis, as opposed to a cost benefit analysis, then you're going to have a very different number coming out of the library. So I would say GDP to begin with isn't a great measure anyway. And certainly in terms of questions like how do we build a resilient society, it's not going to capture things we want. I think there are ways to capture that, but I think it's going to be the social benefit rather than the cost benefit.
All right, can I ask us all just to join in thanking the Professor for his speech? And Daniel, I'll invite you to stay on stage and have a comfy seat and get to rest your voice for a couple of minutes before we call on you again. The next session we're going to run is a panel session. I think we all understand that the research alone doesn't achieve change. The policy that's not based on evidence isn't going to achieve the outcomes we desire. So how do we deliver the leadership to make those things come together, to deliver that disaster risk reduction and resilience building, knowing that is our collective goal? And this needs leadership. So I'm going to invite two key people to join me on stage. Hannah Wandel, OAM, who is currently the acting First Assistant Coordinator General of the Programs and Policies Division at National Emergency Management Agency, who shared with me she didn't watch Brendan's session. So, but we won't let Brendan know that. So Hannah oversees substantial investments in policy initiatives to strengthen Australia's resilience to disasters. Hannah's received the ACT Young Australian of the Year in 2019 and has vast experience in disaster management, regional and social policy, and has previously worked as a senior exec within Prime Minister and Cabinet, implementing the recommendations of the Royal Commission, and is a driving force behind NEMA. And also Christine Ferguson, PSM. Have we got Christine in the room? No? Oh, so now she's not a substitution. Come on up, Christine. Dylan, how are you? Welcome on stage. I don't know if you've been briefed on what this is about, so we'll get. I'll do Dylan's really brief bio. This is Dylan.
Hi, Dylan, the Department of Energy, Environment and Climate Action in Victoria. I'm the Director of Knowledge Planning and Risk there. And Christine was unavoidably, she was.
Yeah, he'll race back and turn it on, I'm sure.
Christine was unavoidably called away and very disappointed because going to another meeting with the Minister's office rather than being here was not at the top of her list for the day. So lovely to see everyone.
We all understand how those things happen. So it's absolutely essential that we can join up this notion of research and policy and deliver it and provide that leadership and make sure they're joined from the outset and one doesn't get thought of as a later thing. So this needs leadership. Leadership that certainly at NHRA we are keen to model, encourage and drive. And it's for that reason we've brought together three key leaders to talk about their views on what these leadership challenges are to influence if we're really going to have a positive effect on driving disaster risk reduction and resilience building. I'm going to ask each of the panel members to give their views on that. Maybe what are the key points that you think we need to change and drive? And especially for us as NHRA, we're keen to make sure that our work is part of that leadership. So if you've got advice to this bunch of key researchers and bureaucrats in the nicest possible way and policy drivers in the room, what's your key message in terms of that leadership? And Dylan, because you've got the mic, if that's all right, I'll start with you.
Why not? Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for having me. It's really great to be here speaking to everyone. We at DECA in Victoria are enormously conscious of our dependence on science and evidence to inform some of the really challenging things that we have to do. I think there's a couple of animating questions for us as land and fire managers, and that's my kind of part of the world at DECA. I work in the Forest Fire and Regions Group, and being simultaneously the Department of Climate Action in Victoria and fire manager for 8 million hectares of pretty high risk real estate in Victoria it's a heady challenge, and the reality is we increasingly are operating in an environment of deep uncertainty and deep conflict and tension, and government is called upon to make pretty tough decisions and to work through some pretty difficult issues with community. The investment that we make in research and the ongoing partnerships that we have with the research community are absolutely indispensable for us. I guess what I can speak to as as one of the definitely one of the bureaucrats in the nicest possible way that you just mentioned, is where we see that there's where we get the most impact and value from research investment, and really. Obviously, the quality and the technical expertise of the people working on the tasks or the programs that we set in motion is indispensable. But we find increasingly that where we've got researchers that are prepared to invest in understanding the complexities of the operating environment that we're in, some of the questions that just came up in the session just now around how can we, what are the ways that we can communicate the value of particular investments? And that's not to say that there's kind of a magic incantation. I saw up on the board one of the questions was, do we need to express everything in dollars and cents? Is that the only way to get it through? Is it about being that reductive? If I can, pick on someone else's question, sometimes, not all the time though. The question that I would really encourage anyone working with a government agency, a government department to engage with is, what decisions are you trying to support and who's making them? Are you looking to support decisions that are being made at the ministerial level? Are you looking to support individuals in that agency working directly with community? What is the evidence? What are the frameworks? What is it that you can bring to bear that will impact the decisions that are being made there? That's not something that obviously researchers can do in their own right. And if I reflect on, I suppose what we kind of bring to the table, government agencies can be long on cash and short on attention span. We can not always be as deeply engaged with the substance of the question that needs answering. It can be easy when you're thrown a challenge to chuck some money at it and not think too hard about it until you've got a report. I'd really encourage anyone who's in that space to be asking the challenging questions that have come up here, and to be thinking carefully about who is going to be using these outputs and what's going to motivate them, particularly in an environment where we've got an ever-increasing politicization of science, and previously, what was regarded as objective knowledge, an erosion of the concept or of the authority of the expert. What are the things that are, what's the stakeholder environment that your decision makers that you're informing, that you're advising are operating in? What's going to help them move through issues? I'm not talking about the politicization of science or research or academia. What I mean here is, how do we use good quality, robust evidence in a highly politicized environment where that's hotly contested?
Excellent, thank you. Anna?
Terrific. I'll just see if my lapel is working. Wonderful. Thanks so much, Ian, and really great to be here. I have the utmost respect for the research sector. NHRA do such a terrific job, so it's really wonderful to be here with all of you. And thank you, Professor, for that great, really terrific presentation. I think from my perspective, and Dylan, you touched on it really well. I mean, I think what I've seen a trend of in the last few years with the drought and then the bushfires and then the last couple of years is there is this great desire for a deeper evidence base. And I've had the real pleasure of being in the Commonwealth Government and working really closely with states and territories and local governments around how we can make decisions with really billions of dollars of here in Australia. So I for my sins, oversee the disaster recovery funding arrangements, so the DRFA from a Commonwealth perspective, our new disaster ready fund, emergency response fund, so a lot of the big programs as well as policy at the Commonwealth level, and we do a lot of that jointly with our state and territory colleagues and local government and other sectors. And I'm seeing a real desire to use evidence to inform our decisions, and something though that I am desperate for and something that I really want to continue building is that evidence base around systemic disaster risk. So how do we actually better understand and quantify and baseline in Australia systemic DRR, and how do we use that as decision makers to inform our investments, and how does the research sector help us make those decisions in a constantly evolving and dynamic environment, because we are constantly under pressure to roll out money quickly. We are under pressure to say, why isn't the Fitzroy River Bridge crossing back up in WA? It's been 4 months since the flood. Why isn't that bridge rebuilt? There is a lot of pressure that comes to us, and so having that really clear research around social infrastructure, about education, about capability programs is really important. And I'm quite excited for those that were at Brendan's, although I didn't tune in, Iain, I got all his notes and I talked to him. So Brendan spoke, I think, yesterday about round 1 of the DRF, so my boss, the Coordinator General at NEMA. And we did, for round 1 of the Disaster Ready Fund, we did have one stream of the $200 million for infrastructure, so green, blue and grey. But then we also put in a second stream about systemic risk reduction projects, so education and capability building and so on. And although we're not at the stage yet that we can talk about the outcomes of that round, I'm so looking forward to what comes out and then evaluating over the coming years how those programs roll out, because we can generate an evidence base to help underpin some of these pieces of work. So I'll stop there.
Excellent. And you've already given me a bunch of questions, so I'm coming back to you.
That's scary, Iain.
Yeah. And Daniel, just building on your presentation in terms of leadership.
Yeah, I'll be the contrarian here. I would say several things for us in the audience. I think most of us are in scholarship and research. And I think one of the failures that we've done, I know I've done this myself as a failure, has been not doing enough advocacy as scholars. So it's not enough, for example, that we win a grant or publish a paper in a peer-reviewed journal that 6 people will read, including my mom if I'm lucky, right? What we need to be doing is, when we have that research project, we need to think, what would the average person in my community get from this? If the answer is not much, I'm not sure why we're doing it, but if the answer is here's some, then how do we write about it for them? Because at the end of the day, right, our civil servants and our politicians' job is to do what the people want. Right, and those people are doing things that are influenced all the time, right? There's all kinds of nonsense in the public sphere. I think our job as researchers and scholars is not just to publish in peer-reviewed journals or books that no one reads. I think our job is to publish in as many high-profile, public-facing venues as possible. So my graduate students suffer from me all the time because of this. I don't let them just do a research project and write an article. They have to do what they do and publish in a public sphere as well. Because again, I think that is how we shape, how we as scholars, people who have that evidence base that we're talking about right now, that's how we're going to shape things. Talking with civil servants is fantastic, being involved in panels and being involved, that's great, right? But the reality is the way we shape society is not just by having our heads down in library carrel, doing the next project and winning a grant. The way we shape society is getting out of the library carrel and marching as a climate protest, getting outside and getting involved. Some of my more radical colleagues in England are involved in things like Extinction Rebellion, right? We can talk about that later if you want to. But I would say it's not just enough that we limit what we do to being scholars speaking to civil servants. We have to speak with the people toward the politicians. We have to influence what they're doing, right? Our job is not just to be people who do research. We have to be scholar advocates as well.
Excellent, thank you. And I'm just looking at my fellow board member, Doug Smith, sitting in the front row. And researchers should all be aware of, as a board, what we're doing now when we're meeting and talking about prospective research projects in the future. We are very focused on making sure there is alignment right from the research question through to the ultimate utilisation, and knowing what that's going to achieve, because one of the gaps, and I'm not sure which one mentioned it then, was about evaluation. And monitoring and evaluation of the outcomes being achieved is a key. It's a real challenge for us, I think, going forward. So what sort of, and from a government perspective first, Hannah, in terms of monitoring and evaluation, what does government look for, from research projects?
Yeah, I mean, I think really government's looking for really crystal clear ways that we can justify expenditure of taxpayer money at the end of the day. There's more than that, but we also do have really important obligations in this space, this disaster response, recovery and risk reduction space. We have significant expenditure, and we know in Australia it's going up. So we need to make sure that we are providing value for the taxpayer. So I think absolutely would agree, we need to ensure that that research is utilised, that it's not just sitting on a shelf there, because in Australia what we're also seeing is priorities are shifting really quickly. Our disaster seasons change between hazards. So 3 years ago, a lot of funding went out for bushfire specific programs. Now it seems to be focused on flood. We need to take this all hazards, whole of continuum approach to make sure that we're underpinning the system versus kind of an ad hoc approach. So anything that can be done that can really help us inform those decisions would be great. I think as well, we often look at what's international best practice, and we also we're really trying to make sure that we're falling underneath international and national frameworks and strategies. So we want to make sure that, and I've heard that over the course of the past few days that governance has been a key theme throughout this forum. So we want to make sure that our investments also fall within the broader international and national best practice. So what is the Sendai midterm review that's coming up in New York this month? What's that saying? And then how do we make sure that our programs and policies align to that? So I think evaluation needs to align to those global and national strategies, but also help to make sure that it's utilised. Yeah.
Thank you. And Don, I'm going to put you on the spot with one, because during Daniel's presentation, you talked about 96% of investment was in hard infrastructure. Now, a few years ago here, we got a very similar report from the Productivity Commission, and it was almost the same figure, I think, from memory. How do we help educate and convince people of the need, maybe not flip that, but balance it more between that hard and soft?
It's a really good question, and I hadn't heard the 96% before, but honestly, I'm surprised that it's not higher. I think, look, at the risk of being supremely unoriginal, the point that you just made around justifying investment and monitoring evaluation is really important here. How do we render the benefits of that kind of soft investment tangible? How do we make them, if you are looking to get, there's more to a business case in government than here's a great photo opportunity with a bridge or a road or a plane or whatever, but gives it a leg up. How do we kind of draw that out and create something that is an eye-catching, kind of eye-catching elevator pitch, either to a ministerial decision maker or for that ministerial decision maker to use elsewhere. Is probably a challenge there. I think that it's being recorded. The point that you made around scholar advocacy is important as well. We certainly see certainly see in government the impact that it has when knowledgeable people speak in other forums, and speak outside of the literature. That kind of, that cycle of, secondary coverage of academic outputs. Where certainly in Australia, things research is done, it pops up in the conversation, it then pops up in other media outlets. It gives salience to that kind of discourse that's not available through other channels. So there's those kinds of ideas. I think there's ways to improve their advocacy to the holders of the purse strings, but there's also ways to indirectly change the incentive environment that those purse string holders have.
Excellent, thank you. So the challenge now is to the scholars in the room and the researchers in the room and the bureaucrats in the room. What is it that you need? What's the burning question in terms of the leadership? So I open it to the floor. We've got the microphones wandering around again. Questions of the panel members in terms of how you can impact leadership or how we can collectively address these issues. You've had lots of time to think about them until then, and we'll get Slido is up. Good, thank you. So while the microphone people are thinking of putting their hand up, I'll start at the top because it's got the 4 likes. What are some of the leading social infrastructure disaster resilience programs or funding initiatives you've come across? And I'll open that up to the panel broadly.
So I can say that I have seen very few, if any, deliberate uses of social infrastructure in a DRR context. So typically, again, in North America at least, and in Japan, funding for these is ad hoc. It is end of budget cycle questions, and they are seen as local amenities, right, rather than critical elements of a broader disaster plan. So most of the funding that comes for things like parks, like libraries, like pubs, that funding, if it comes at all, is in the context of, oh, by the way, there's no funding left for this cycle. Do we can fund them or not? As opposed to, we're building our society's trust. Those bridging ties are being created here. Here's the kind of money that we need. So I've seen almost no attempts to fit social infrastructure into a broader DRR context.
So there's a challenge for all of us from the start. So, and with one of the projects that was talked about yesterday, I'm just trying to I'm thinking out loud as I go, but the issue of heat. And as the climate changes, heat waves are going to become more of a problem. And you say libraries and clubs and social centres would seem to be an absolute DRR investment in providing places of public cooling. But I wonder if we have to change our thinking around what risk is and what hazards are and how we influence that, and the advocacy would go straight to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And yep, there we go. I think that something that we are just really eager for is ongoing risk assessments in Australia, and this might not be the time to say it, but I'll just put it out there because it's something that we're desperate for. But multifaceted risk assessments that can help inform those decisions, and I think there's great work that's happening. I know our colleagues in the Federal Department of Climate Change are doing some great work, our Australian Climate Service colleagues, but we need to make sure that all domains, so social infrastructure and social capital, is built into those risk assessments to help us make decisions. So I would say that's an area that we really need in Australia. We don't really have a definitive source of information to help make some of those decisions. So that's something that I'd put out there. Going a little bit off topic, Iain, but why not? I also think that we're trying a few different things at the moment. So I think Brendan spoke about this hazard insurance partnership that we've just set up. We've had a couple of meetings. It's government, it's insurers. We're throwing around some key issues, some legacy issues around data sharing, around information, around commercial and confidence information. How do we actually start bringing together different sectors? And that's governance, that's not social infrastructure, but we're trying to build governance in Australia to tackle some of these key issues. And so I am, I suppose, excited about some of these bits of progress, these steps forward that we're making to try and bring sectors together. I'm not saying that we're there. There's still so much to do, and we've got this whole system that we need to continue to build and strengthen, but we're taking some steps forward, and I think the research sector can really help us in some of those areas.
And governance is a key priority of the disaster risk reduction strategy framework.
Absolutely, priority 4.
As is enhanced investment.
Exactly, priority 3. So, exactly. It's almost like you're involved when it all came together.
And that, I think that leads to the question up there for Hannah and Dylan. It says, what specific evidence is missing that would help government justify expenditure?
For one of us?
Both, either both,
I mean, for me, that risk assessment piece is really, really critical. I saw something recently where something came to me and it was referencing the old bushfire hazards, the former NHRA predecessor,
CRC.
the CRC, like the purple map, I always call it the purple map, the resilience map on the website from 2011, because that was what this person who had a proposal could find publicly to help justify expenditure in a certain region. So I know like Minderoo, Red Cross, there's so much really good work that's been happening out there. There's state risk assessments that are really terrific. Queensland has a really good model, but I think that there is still some of that information that's missing that brings it all together. So that would be really helpful. And as I said, there are things in train, but that's probably top of my list. Yeah.
I'm not sure that I've got, I feel exposed following that really good answer, and kind of, a little bit being the fire and forest guy. But if I can offer what I have seen, like this can become a lot more tangible for government in the recovery process and in rebuilding resilience. So if we can kind of draw on those experiences and kind of capture and render accessible the experiences of community members and what assists them in re-establishing, their individual lives and their social connection in the wake of a disaster, and think about how that can be applied in a prospective way that might give our evidence base that a little bit more cut through and complement the kind of broader scale risk assessment work that you're talking about, which I agree is kind of foundational. And kind of thinking about what you've talked about the cake, and I'm perhaps talking about the icing.
Thank you.
Just add one layer.
Please.
Okay. So along with risk assessment, which I think is great, I think also communal resource presence or assets mapping. So I've tried several times here using Australian data to build the same kind of research, and I couldn't do it. And I've talked to several colleagues here, both in New South Wales, but also where I am in South Adelaide. There are no regionally accepted, and certainly no nationally accepted data sets right now, just on social capital. Forget about social infrastructure. Social capital, for example, asking you right now, is your community well connected? How much budding versus bridging versus linking do you have? There is no, to my knowledge at least, no national data set that has been created yet for this country of Australia, let alone regionally accepted processes in the census level. So I think even beyond risk, which is a great question, I flip that around. Risk is great, but risks change over time, right? You flip between fire and water, sure, but COVID wasn't on the list either, right? That wasn't there. So I would say less than risk assessment is what community resources are there. And the only way to know that is if someone in this room or someplace sits down and says, we need to have consistent measures and how we capture social cohesion and social capital in our country, not individual papers, not my index versus yours, not BRIC or COBRA or all the nonsense. What's available in Australia right now consistently to use, it'll be updated over time. And if we don't have that, then we can't talk about risk at all.
A well-received response. Does anyone want to make a comment on that or ask another question? Because that goes to there.
I think my comment goes back to your point, Iain, about how we can influence decision makers as researchers and bureaucrats. So I'm Blythe McLennan from NHRA. I guess I wanted to make the point that we often, when we talk about evidence, we often go to numbers and metrics and dollars. And I just wanted to make sure we don't forget the power of storytelling and narratives. And I can't now remember who it was, but someone at this forum raised that point really well in one of the sessions, that stories are much more memorable. And I'm biased as a qualitative researcher background, but I just wanted to make sure that when we are discussing evidence and influencing decision makers, we're not just talking about graphs and numbers. So I guess a follow-on question from that perhaps to the panel is what sort of appetite or where do you see stories being influential to leaders in this area?
Really quickly from me, incredibly important, and I think case studies always form an incredibly important part of our evaluations, which I won't go into, but within NEMA that's incredibly important. But I think deeply compelling, not only for helping to generate behavioural change with the community and to generate change with policymakers, but also to kind of remind us all that these are real people and real communities and real issues. So I agree. I think it's a great point.
I'm just wondering if there's anyone on the floor might like to comment on this and do it far more justice than I can. But building on that storytelling concept, yesterday we had the yarning session, and what really struck home to me was the notion of, whilst we try and engage our First Nations people, the cultural issue of extracting cultural knowledge and misusing it rather than respecting it was an issue that came up. I just wonder if there's anyone from the floor wants to build on that, because I thought that was a really powerful session, and an issue that, it goes to, governments want to go in and do things to communities sometimes, even though we'll say we'll do it with. What does that really mean?
I might just take, oh wow, that's loud. I might take it back a step. If you do share the vulnerability of your society, or you do the Daniel's assessment of the entire country, I do wonder how people will fear how that data is used, but also how to game that system to ensure that they're not, oh, look, our community's great. We might not get as much funding in the future. We might not get the same support. So making a safe place for people to provide their stories, to share what experiences they have, without it detrimentally affecting how they're going to be treated in the future. Because if you do talk about your vulnerability to fire, your insurance agencies may start to use that data and go, oh my goodness, you're not living there anymore, because you won't be able to afford it. And this is those fear that comes with the more that we are vulnerable, how does that data get used? So it could be the First Nations, it could be just knowing your vulnerabilities and sharing it.
I can talk to that.
Yeah, if you'd like.
Sure, I don't want to take up my fellow panelists' time, but I think that's a really great point, and I think that goes back to governance and trust and having those conversations. I hear similar things: insurance information, house prices, a fear of not receiving, a share of funding. I think it comes to generating governance forums and having discussions with one another and making sure that everyone who has equities in these decisions has a forum to be heard. So I don't think that they're unjustified concerns, but I don't think they're a reason for us not to go down that path. I think it's just about actually having an inclusive system where we're able to have those conversations in Australia.
Thanks, Anna. Now here's a question. I don't know that, I'm not expecting anyone to have the answer to this one, but we're placing such an importance on research to provide us with the evidence. And yet one of the questions, the top one on the screen you can see in front, is PhD researchers are often at the forefront of new research and innovation. Is there any consideration of raising the scholarship to a livable wage? So just general views. We're not going to hold anyone to it and say this is a NEMA policy, by the way. But internationally, Daniel, in terms of, if we want the best research, if we want people to spend their time and energy and effort working on something, are we treating that research sector in the right way?
It's funny, we worry about ethical scholarship, and we should all the time. To what degree are we going out into communities and taking from them? At the same time, we expect our PhD candidates in America on less than $30,000 a year to live for 5 years and raise families, which is ridiculous. So a number of my colleagues and I have been involved in both unionization and also right now strikes At places like Rutgers, for example, you might have heard that we successfully had a campaign there to raise wages for PhD researchers. So I completely agree, right? We need to be ethical researchers, but in the same way, we can't be exploited because of our desire to get a PhD. And also at the same time, what are we mapping as ourselves? How are we showing off our own broader lives? What are we doing to help out our colleagues who have problems like this? So I think it is on us, again, to be scholar advocates, not just to be happy that we have a position of power, but to use that power to get stuff for other people.
And I think there's a challenge in there then to us as a research centre is how we can influence that area and provide that leadership as well. So, not that I have the answer. So. Now there was one, Hannah, that was particularly, I'm just trying to look for it, was talking about you were asking for risk assessments and greater granularity in the risk assessments. Is that at a particular level, national, regional, or local, or is it something that starts and builds up to a bigger picture?
I think in a utopia you have it all, right, Iain? Like let's go big or go home. I think all levels are useful. I think national risk assessments are useful, but we know local knowledge. I mean, the Sendai midterm review in Australia showed the value of locally led initiatives and local risk assessments, and how, I mean, to many of the points that you made, Daniel, around making sure that local decision makers can influence outcomes, and to do that you need local risk assessments. So all of it is incredibly useful for us, but I think for also people in the community to make sure that they're empowered to know where their risks are, where their vulnerabilities are, and if they're given that $1 million again, which you never know, that they don't need to come to us and ask the question, because they already know that they know where their risks and vulnerabilities are, and they can make those decisions without 3 levels of government kind of squabbling over what the right thing to do is. So it's all important. And what I would also say is planning is important. So it's not just about the assessments, but it's about what's your local recovery plan if you've had an event, what's your local resilience plan, think about these things ahead of time, which I know so many communities are doing, and it's really exciting, and it's supported by a lot of the great people in this room, but also our not-for-profit and philanthropy sector who are doing really great work with communities to get resilience plans in place. That's really exciting, and that's a step forward.
And in fact, there's a question there about our not-for-profit and NGO sector who have for a long time built monitoring and evaluation of their programs.
Absolutely.
And particularly in the international space, and I know doing some international development programs through DFAT. So there's a question saying, do DFAT and NEMA talk?
All the time. We have an international section. Talk to Richard Samuels, Alex Nichols, Jade. Put your hand up, Jade. Jade, go talk to Jade. I oversee it as well, but talk to them. We do every day.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So Dylan, you were wanting to say.
I was just going to jump on the have your cake and eat it too strategy of, it's not national or local or state, it's all of the above. Generalised national or state or even sometimes regional level, kind of information lacks the particularity to be powerful in that storytelling sense, but also localised information that can't be scaled can then, frustrate your ability to attract attract attention and funding when you're in that kind of bigger mix of seeking resources to action the insights that have become available.
Excellent. So Daniel, I'd be really interested in the international perspective of this. Given that climate is changing, is it too late to wait for more data? And how do we support leaders to make decisions in an uncertain environment?
Yeah, we definitely don't want more committees, right? I think it's pretty obvious climate change is here. It's pretty obvious that we have communities that are already creating climate refugees. We have them certainly in North America. I know you have them here in Australia as well. So yes, we don't want to use this as an excuse to push things off. At the same time, again, I think we're overly concerned with risk assessments and not enough with local asset mapping, right? Because the reality is there are shocks that are hitting us now or before. We never thought about COVID-19 is a good example. Despite all the plans in the books, none of us were ready for COVID. No, North America wasn't ready. Japan, Italy, none of us were really ready for that. Our societies are better prepared when we're more cohesive, when we're connected, when we're trusting. So those are things we can always be working on building. And there are spillover effects, right, from having those outcomes. Societies that are more trusting, societies that are more cohesive, they have better impact on citizens' lives, right? There's more walking outside, there's less crime, there's more people engagement, right? The businesses are getting more money. So, across the board, there are spillovers from building things like social cohesion. So in my mind, rather than waiting for the next risk assessment, right, our job should be, okay, here are the communities that we know already from data that have lower levels of cohesion, trust, engagement, and so forth. And here's how we're going to fix those communities, right? Or they're going to fix themselves, right? And so rather than waiting for the next risk, okay, it'll be pig flu or swine flu or whatever, SARS or COVID or whatever the diseases we've had before, rather than worrying about the next risk, we can always be building on strengths. And I think that's where we need to start, this micro-local idea of community budgeting, where communities make decisions about the future. And again, they recognize perfectly well, communities recognize their own levels of assessment. So I think that's where we start, from the bottom up.
Excellent, thank you. And I think this one leads on a little bit when you talk about communities knowing and engagement with. And Daniel, have you researched bonding, bridging, linking social capital across cultures? So example, assume this would be quite different for First Nations communities in Australia and between First Nations and white Australia and disaster recovery outcomes.
Yeah, I wouldn't deem to start talking about Australia. I know nothing about Australia besides you drive on the wrong side of the street, but I would say that the bonding, bridging, and linking work across cultures. We've done this in multiple societies, including Japan, including Israel, Mexico, Singapore, North America. So the way they manifest is quite different. Right, so for example, bonding, social ties, or bridging might work quite differently in Japan and India, but the universality of them is that in Japan and in India and North America, there are bonding, bridging, and linking ties. So I would say that I would worry less about, are there ties, and I'd be more concerned about what's the form they take, right, in the local society.
Excellent, thank you. And I'm looking around the room, there's no one raising their hands urgently to grab the microphone again. And yes, Doug, I can see you tapping your watch. Thank you. My timekeeper is looking after me. He thinks I'm going to take 20 minutes to close. I'm not, so we're getting an early mark. So the final comment is there anything you'd like to add to this group of people who are committed to research which is useful, usable, and used at the end of the day? At the end of the day, you are providing the leadership for the implementation of a lot of this, and we need to deliver what you need to make our communities safer. So a chance for a final word.
My final word, I think I saw a question just before that said something along the lines of, don't wait for data, how do we empower leaders to make decisions in uncertainty? We are making decisions with uncertainty. That happens every day. Look at the last 6 months, look at the last 3 years. So absolutely hear you there, totally agree. And that's a huge part of the way that we operate. How do you work in a real-time environment to make those key decisions? And you use all of your inputs, your national, international best practice, your case studies. We come to a range of different stakeholders. We look at the local level, but I suppose what I'm saying is you can always do better. You can always build, and I think that's something that it's really exciting that we can all collaborate on.
Excellent, thank you.
Thanks.
I definitely wouldn't want to see anyone waiting for more data. As you say, we're making the decision. If you say, well, we'll postpone the decision until we've got the more data, you make the decision by default, don't you? There's a tenor in some of the questions I can see on the screen around, and in the discussion today around. How do we get the balance right between, hard versus soft interventions? Do we bias? Does risk modelling contribute to a bias? I think we're always going to need a breadth of interventions. If I think about it from my agency's perspective, we're very, very invested in human life, in social cohesion, in those human dimensions of natural hazards, but we're also deeply interested in how we manage the adaptation of natural systems in climate change. I feel like it might be trite to say to a group of researchers to avoid false binaries, but that'll probably be my last pearl of wisdom.
Thank you. And Daniel, I'll give the last word to you.
Just first of all, thank you for being here, and I think your presence alone shows your commitment. And I would just say, let's model it. Turn to someone nearby that you don't know and introduce yourself before you leave. So let's build those networks.
Thank you very much. Can I ask all of us to join in thanking our panel members this afternoon?
Thank you, Iain.
did well.
So I think that was a fantastic session, and it's just for me to now close this session and release you and let you go, so I won't hold you. But I was just thinking back on the past few days and some of our key messages as a research centre, and those three words keep coming back to me: useful, usable and used research, because we want to be solving problems. It's got to be for a purpose, and at the end of the day we want to see it used. I tend to think sometimes, we see research papers written. We saw the one published this morning and released this morning, and I think if I want to hide a book, where's the best place in the world to hide a book? It's in a library, because if you put it out of sequence, people don't find it, and we don't want to see our research papers, our work end up in libraries, frankly. I want to see it on the desks of politicians. I want to see that research summary out of the floods on the desk of the bureaucrats, on the desk of the commissioners, on the desks of the directors general or the secretaries of education, health, transport, main roads, electricity sectors. I want it on their desks. I want it on the policymakers' desks, so that they're picking it up and reading it, and it's not something that has just been published. So I think our challenge out of all of this was that advocacy piece that was talked about. And that's certainly our role as a centre, as we see, and we will drive that forward. And we want to see our work used in development of standards, the developments of plans, the development of policy, and the development of good practice. And there was, I think, one word seemed to come out a lot in the sessions today, and that was about being predictive. And I think about predictive, and largely it's prediction of impacts and physical vulnerabilities and the use in operational decision making. And I think we can go much broader as we go forward, and I loved it hearing about consequence management today, because that starts to tie in that whilst we might work in little disciplines, disaster management, hazard management, however we frame it, is not a discipline. It is made up of many, many disciplines. So it is truly an interdisciplinary approach that we need to adopt and embrace. And we need to ask that question, so what? So we've done this, so what? What are the economic outcomes? What are the human social? What are the environmental? And we start to think, well, actually, they're just the pillars of recovery that are often talked about. And I think if we think about society as made up of those pillars, then our work impacts on each or more than each and every one of those. So it's about closing the loop around our stakeholders, our shareholders, our end users, that it's not just one agency and it's not just one sector, but it's every piece that makes up that society that we want to impact and bring together, make our research bring together. And they're looking for those linkages. And the importance of research is not just the alignment of disaster risk reduction and resilience priorities. It's much more, and it's trying to build that challenge. So I want to thank all of the speakers, all of the researchers, certainly all of the NHRA team, University of Melbourne, RMIT, and everyone that's been involved in this process, but mostly to the people that have not just got up on stage and presented their work or the starts of their work or their insights, but for the many tireless hours. And I recognise that comment there about, and the ethical decisions about research. Maybe we're not just giving back to our researchers enough. So I think that is a joint challenge that we need to take away from this. But I want to leave you with the challenge as well, whether you're from an agency, government, private, whether you're an academic. I want you to think about your role in disaster risk reduction and resilience, not just from a viewpoint of what research I am doing or what research question, but who else can I engage with? Who else will this impact on? The notion of heat, it's not just a health problem. It's a transport problem, it's a railway problem, it's a water supply problem, it's an electricity problem. It's every part of government and society. And how can you provide that leadership that's required, building on the great words of our three panellists to ensure that our research going forward is useful, usable, and ultimately used, and we're proud to see it on the desks of the politicians, the policymakers, and the bureaucrats. Thank you very much for your attendance. Look forward to seeing you again at our events in the future, and certainly this forum as it grows into next year as well. Thank you very much.